Hi, it's Brian Winter. The Americas Society Gallery in New York City is a fantastic place to see art from Latin America. Our current exhibit is called Amazonia Azul. It's a truly unique pan-Amazonian show, bringing together paintings, sculptures, photographs, and more from all 9 countries of the Amazon region. It's on view through April 2026. We hope to see you here. Welcome to the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. As Latin America prepares for an election supercycle over the next 12 months, security is the number one political issue in many countries. Today, an overview of how and why organized crime has become such a major concern for voters in this cycle.
The control of many areas of everyday life, the control of many economic activities are in the hands of criminal structures that perhaps are not as violent and sophisticated such as the Cartel del Golfo or Sinaloa cartel, but they are really close to the local governments, regional governments. They have close, even family ties to those. So the criminal governance, this parallel state, is imbricated within this state.
We're about to embark on a so-called supercycle of elections in Latin America, with Bolivia, Chile, Costa Rica, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil all set to elect presidents in the next 13 months. In several of these countries, crime is showing up in polls as the number one political issue, ahead of other concerns like unemployment, corruption, and education. If you live in Latin America, or you follow the region, this makes a lot of sense. Organized crime groups are seemingly more powerful than ever, fueled by a stunning increase in the production of cocaine, which has tripled, yes, tripled, over the past decade, according to the United Nations. Flush with cash, gangs are increasingly involved in other sectors like illegal mining and logging, but also more formal parts of the economy, as evidenced by a huge police raid a few weeks ago on financial companies in Sao Paulo, where investigators allege that an organized crime group was engaged in billions of dollars worth of money laundering and fraud schemes related to the theft of fuel. To help explain these complex dynamics and how they're likely to continue to evolve, we've invited my friend Lucía Dammert. Lucía is one of those rare people who truly has a regional understanding of security. Originally from Peru, she has also lived in Argentina and worked extensively on security issues in Mexico and Central America. She served in Chile as chief of advisors during the first year of the Gabriel Boric administration. Now she teaches at the Universidad de Santiago de Chile and is the author of a new book, Anatomía del poder ilegal, Violencia, crimen organizado y corrupción en América Latina. Lucía, welcome back to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Ryan.
Lucía, as I mentioned in the introduction, you have such a unique perspective because you've worked on security issues in so many different countries. You've been in university, you've been inside government. What is new about what's happening right now on security throughout Latin America?
Well, unfortunately, there are at least 4 specific issues, I think. First, for many years in Latin America, we talk about the exceptional countries, that we had some countries in which corruption, violence, organized crimes were not as present as Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Chile. And now we do not have those exceptional situations. Secondly, besides drug trafficking, we have a multiplicity of different illegal economies that are thriving and, growing really strong in Latin America in general. Third, we have to keep a specific eye on the Amazon basin. The Amazon is an area that for many years was left by itself by many Amazonian countries, and nowadays is the epicenter of many illegal markets. And the fourth one is that these illegal markets are so strong. They have so much money that they have been able to enhance corrupt practices throughout the region. And also they have been able to limit the capacity and the strength of the state. So it's a very different ballgame, I think.
So let's go one by one through these and start with no more exceptions. The idea that these countries that were previously seen as relative oases in Latin America, you mentioned Chile, Costa Rica, Uruguay, another example. How much of this is due to what we've seen happen in the production of cocaine over the last 10 years? I, Lucia, have just constantly been shocked by these numbers. The latest UN numbers suggest that the amount of cocaine being produced in the world, and almost all of it comes from Latin America, has tripled over the last 10 years. And it's not just flowing north anymore, it's flowing west, east, and south. Is that the main reason why some of these countries that were previously kind of relatively off the map are now seeing these troubles?
Yeah, well, what you mentioned is true. We have a very unique, sophisticated, and innovative cocaine industry in Latin America, specifically Colombia and Peru, the main producers of cocaine. But we have three different elements. One, we have more people that are consumers of cocaine and other drugs throughout the region. Second, these illegal markets are flexible and they were finding the better ways to move their cocaine. And in some specific moments, they use Chile because Chile was not considered unsafe port, the US and European institutions. And the third thing is that money laundering, those organizations have to launder their money. And they found specific places such as Uruguay and Chile in some parts to be places in which organized crime was not as important in the public policy discussion. So they were, quote unquote, open markets. We have many people who are buying, I don't know, counterfeited cigarettes or, that are willing to contract migrants who have been trafficked throughout the region. So now the culture of legality that was very strong in those countries have weakened, I think.
You talk in your book about the formation of parallel power structures. Perhaps that's less of an issue in Chile than it is in some other countries around the region. What do you mean by those parallel power structures, and how has that evolved over the last 10 years?
Yeah, for many years, we talked about the criminal governance, some specific areas, specific territories in which structures such as el Clan del Golfo or Tren de Aragua or the Sinaloa cartel had the capacity to govern those areas. And those were very specific in some countries such as Mexico and Colombia, perhaps, bigger territories. But that implied the fact that the state was not present in those areas. What we have found is that is not actually the case now. That the case now is that there are territories in which the state is actually present, but the control of many areas of everyday life, the control of many economic activities are in the hands of criminal structures that perhaps are not as violent and sophisticated, such as the Cartel del Golfo or Sinaloa cartel, but they are really close to the local governments, regional governments. They have close, even family ties to those. So the criminal governance, this parallel state, is imbricated within the state. It's very related to the politics at the local and regional level, more than the national. So, you have this parallel structure that has political links, that has the capacity to penetrate the state, and then that in some specific areas, they bring security, they charge citizens with through extortion, and that is something that is really new. And this is not a nuance, it's not a detail, because in order to fight this type of criminal structures that are more than just gangs, it's a mafia type of organizations. Of course, you have to have not only stronger state capacities, but also politicians with, sustainable political will to encounter, not only violence, but also all types of threats from these organizations.
Lucia, I will once again resist the temptation to delve into policy questions, and let's focus on the diagnosis for now. You mentioned the Amazon. Why has that region become so much more of a challenge from a security perspective over the last 10 years?
Well, that is a region in which an immense part is not present by, it has no state presence. And I think that is something that has to be taken into account. There is also newer illegal markets that have been strengthened in the last 10 to 15 years. I will say illegal mining, specifically gold. This is a huge illegal market. And most studies show that the revenue of the gold mineral industry is even larger than the drug trafficking illegal market. Also, you have an increasing level of environmental markets, not only lodging, but also animal use. And, you have many areas in which criminal organizations have been able to organize their work and freely work through using these areas to move people who are trafficked, or even those who are on slavery, specifically women. So in that area that is far from capital cities, that is far from where the elites are actually, looking in terms of homicides and violence, those are the areas that I think are more prone to these type of alternative state presence or alternative type of criminal governance. This is not an urban problem any longer. This is not, capital with people with money that will buy drugs. This is, something that in the Amazonian region shows a more in-depth and more profound situation.
Lucia, the reality you're describing is so different from the reality in most capitals around the region. I mean, I'm based in New York, but I take quite a lot of pride in the amount of time that I spend traveling within Latin America because, it's important to my job. But the kinds of places you're describing, frankly, are a little bit off the radar for a lot of people, including, I suspect, many of our listeners. What does it feel like to be in some of those places? I mean, I know you spent some time in some of these areas outside capitals that are dealing with these challenges. I mean, does what you're describing it sounds awful? Does it feel like that in the day-to-day in some of these places, or is it more hidden?
Well, it's really awful, but on the other hand, for many citizens, they have some structure that brings security. And during COVID, those structures that are criminal, but those structures also brought medicine. They also brought food. They also brought, labor and employment. So one of the main issues that I found and that's because that's why my book is illegal power, not illegal criminal organizations, but illegal power. One of the things that struck me the most is that when you talk to many Latin Americans, illegal power is something that they relate either to criminal organizations, but also to politicians. Because they think that the power that is governing them have corruption practices, they have been in jail, the opposition has also corrupt practices. They don't really make the difference between the illegal and the legal power. And I think this is something that is eroding, democratic capacities.
What you've just told me is one of the most upsetting things I think I've ever heard on this podcast. This idea that people don't see any real difference between what we think of as the state and these illegal powers.
When you live in a place in which your mayor has been indicted with, illegal mining activities, and then the spouse or the brother is in jail for homicide, and there is a lot of different elements that will show you that there was a lot of corrupt practices throughout the election. And then when the mayor was elected, all public work was done through companies of their friends and family. Well, people are not really that naive. They realize that something is happening throughout this political elite. And of course, this is not that happens throughout Latin America, but I think that most of the frustration that Latin Americans have nowadays with politicians, most of the frustration and the anger and the need for some type of change is related to that.
Okay, well, so this is a pretty serious policy problem. I'm sure we'd agree, but not a hopeless one. So let's look at possible responses to this and responses that we've already seen across the region. You mentioned the need, above all, I think, to build up state capacity in a lot of different countries. How are we doing on that? Is there anybody who is doing it well? What is the road ahead, and what models can we look at?
Well, there are not many models. The first thing that I have to say is that building a state capacity is within the rule of law, within the human rights recognition, because of course there are some models in Latin America that are going autocratic, that are, that have the capacity to put everyone on jail. But of course, this is something that the literature and the reality always show you that it's short term.
You're referring, I'm sure, to President Bukele in El Salvador.
It's El Salvador, but also, something that what is happening in Nicaragua, when you have state capacity to really limit the opposition capability to talk, or and to put in jail everyone that is not agreeing with you, or that you think that it's a criminal, then these are and has always been short-term policies in Latin America and in the world in general. There are I think presidents and governments and politicians that are very much afraid of what a mafia state could bring to Latin America. And I think that just President Lula enhanced the discussion on environmental crimes in the UN. There is all the changes that I mentioned in Chile with new laws. There is an important police reform that happened in Uruguay that tried to tackle some of the problems that the organized crime industry is developing there. There are several small pieces. The problem is that they're very small and they're pieces, and that the political will is very sporadic. I think that there are at least four elements that have to be taken into account. First, we really need to take security out of the electoral debate.
But I'm sure you'd agree that it's legitimate to have debate around security, not only causes, but solutions.
Yes, yes, of course. What I'm saying is that if this has to be a debate, but the incentives to be just an electoral debate is an incentive that move us far from the structural problem and into the quote unquote, magic bullets that will finish this quickly. The second element is that we really need to fight corruption. Corruption is an issue that is very important in Latin America. And for some reason, for many years, we thought that perhaps it's not really linked to homicides, or it's really not linked to other problems.
Just a personal observation on that. I mean, there was a time when at AQ, and speaking for myself, we were dedicating a lot of attention to corruption issues. I would say, in the late 2010s when Lava Jato was kind of at its peak. And then, well, then we had a pandemic, but we also had kind of a backlash against the corruption probes themselves. And it doesn't seem to me like a topic that people really want to discuss much anymore, whether they're on left or right, because I've sensed, and I'm not just talking about Brazil here, I'm talking about really everywhere, kind of this view that, we opened that Pandora's box. It didn't really lead us anywhere good. So it's best that we just kind of leave that alone.
Well, I agree with you. And I think this is something that has to be changed because the problem with corruption is not a relationship between the private sector and some part of the political actors. Nowadays, the problem is that the illegal markets, they are getting into legal areas and they are the ones enhancing corrupt practices from the local to the national. So if we do not put corruption in the center of the political agendas, this thing, I mean, criminal structure will continue to thrive because when we talk about criminal structures in Latin America, we're not talking about small gangs, street gangs. We're talking about really huge criminal industries that have a gray area and then have a very strong legal area that is being, nurtured by all the money that is being laundered. So we really need to tackle the relationship between those legal areas and the political realm and the political structure. So I agree with you that corruption is not center, but we really need to go back to that.
So let's speak in practical terms. I mean, the need to increase state capacity, the need to battle corruption, the need to look at this as being a holistic issue where you're not just fighting drug dealing, but you're fighting illegality and these illegal powers kind of across the board. I feel like everyone in the policy space recognizes that those are the things that need to be done. I mean, it would be great, but as you yourself recognize, there aren't that many clear models to follow. Very little of it, or not enough of it at least, has been done in practice. At the same time, we are on the verge of an electoral cycle in the region that includes Chile, but also Peru, Costa Rica, Colombia, and then in October of 2026, Brazil, where we have right-wing candidates that are all to some extent campaigning with security as their main issue. Does that make you more hopeful that both, that we'll have a debate around some of these security issues and that we might see governments that will dedicate the resources and attention necessary to begin to get these problems at least somewhat more under control?
Not really, because I think that the discussion now is centered around one of the elements of the problem and not real. When you take a look at illegal mining, for instance, in many countries in which illegal mining is getting stronger, the industry is really getting stronger because they have been able to pass laws that allow that industry to get stronger. It's not only illegality, you know what I mean? So in fact, the penetration of those illegal markets into the political discussion is really, really high. And this is something that I am not sure if we are really perceiving the complexity of this problem. My sense is that security will be part of the discussion. And hopefully, the discussion about security will include state capacity, not only the police capacity to fight crime, but also, the state in general to fight culture of illegality. And then the right and the left have to realize that they also have to enhance these policies to fight political activities that links those same people to criminal industries.
What I'm hearing is it's not enough to put more police and maybe even military on the streets if you've also got a legal structure that allows for, illegal gold mining to be one of the main motors of your economy and therefore a big funder of politics. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Yes, that exactly. And so, of course, we need to have better police. Of course, we need to enhance the capacity of our jails. Of course, public security has to be better. But the extent and the magnitude of the problem that we are facing now in Latin America requires different responses. And in those countries in which, the legal powers are more and more and getting stronger, those responses require, a complete different political discussion.
I know that you are not a fan of the Nayib Bukele model of dealing with these issues. As you look at this upcoming electoral cycle and the popularity of Bukele and some of the polls, I mean, there are polls that show that in Chile, 81% of Chileans approve of Bukele. He's also the most popular politician among Ecuadorians. I've seen a poll in Peru that shows him as being very popular. I mean, is it your feeling, do you think that we'll see governments that will try to implement some version of this model, or will local realities restrain them somewhat? What do you expect?
I expect politicians to play the Bukele rhetoric, but I don't perceive that if they win, they will be able to develop the same model, because the situation of El Salvador is very, very different from all Latin American countries, perhaps all of them, because of the size of the country, because of the role that the country played in the international illegal market arena, which is very slow, very, very low, because of the societal problems that El Salvador had. So I think that what the President Bukele did, and did very well, was to show that a response was needed. But then the model also have very, strong restrictions of democracy in general. But besides that topic, President Noboa in Ecuador tried to develop the same policies and hasn't been that successful, because, our countries have different situations. But in terms of the rhetoric of the Bukele model, yeah, we will have a lot of that. And of course, after a while, when they do not deliver, we'll have people frustrated, with the things that they actually propose to do, that they will not be able to do. I mean, in countries such as Peru or Colombia or even Chile, it is impossible to really build a jail that is ginormous from one place to the other based on, I think, I think it was Chinese financing, or an international financing of that construction, and then just put people there without due process. So my sense is that the rhetoric is going to be good. And for many Latin Americans, they're buying a small part of the Bukele model. But as soon as they perceive how the Bukele model is in general, they will be more afraid of that implementation.
I've been struck by the fact that no true Bukele acolyte has yet won the presidency elsewhere in Latin America.
Yeah, Noboa tried to, and also the situation in Ecuador was really, really awful. When you become an important part of that international industry, then you do have corruption. You do have, state incapacity. It's not only, some gangs on streets. You have a structural problem. So President Noboa tried to implement the rhetoric and put some of the armed forces, guarding jails. But of course, that hasn't been enough. But just to make sure, Brian, for all our audience, that having low levels of homicide doesn't really show that you have been successful in fighting organized crime. Perhaps shows that criminal organizations have the total monopoly of that territory and that illegal practice. So they don't have to fight anyone. And of course, they are not fighting the state because the state has decided not to fight them.
Well, and a possible example of that would be a city where I lived for many years, Sao Paulo, which now has a very low homicide rate, almost as low as New York City, in fact. But also, as we record this, we just saw the assassination of a prominent organized crime investigator in the state. In August, we also saw a huge police raid on Faria Lima, which is Brazil's Wall Street, on allegations that several financial institutions were engaged in money laundering and fraud for the PCC, Brazil's biggest gang.
Yeah, and that is something, Brian, that shows the difficulty to really fight criminal industries. Because, when you have just gangs, well, you have to fight the gang, limit, the level of violence, limit the level of homicides, and that will be most of it. But when you're fighting an industry that their goal is to have money, the goal is to really make profit out of their products. The products can be people or drugs or whatever. Then it's more difficult to identify their presence and identify the monopoly of power that they have in a specific territory or even country. And I think we are far from having mafia states throughout Latin America. But if we do not recognize the presence of these illegal industries, we will continue to move forward a very bad future.
Lucía, thanks so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.